This is what you bring me, Dad." My son's laughter cut through the music like broken glass. The chandeliers shimmered above us. The string quartet froze mid-note, and 600 pairs of eyes turned toward the stage. Ethan held up the small navy blue box I'd wrapped myself, shaking it for the crowd like a cheap party favor. His diamond cufflinks threw sparks across the ballroom ceiling. Vanessa, his bride of 1 year and self-appointed queen of Scottsdale social media, covered her mouth, giggling. "Oh my God, Ethan, is that from him?" she whispered into the mic she'd forgotten was still on. The guests laughed with her, eager to please the hosts who'd just spent $300,000 on this charity gala. I stayed seated at table 6, hands folded around a glass of water that trembled only slightly. The ballroom smelled of lilies, champagne, and money that didn't belong to my son. "My name is Raymond Pierce, 72 years old. I built bridges for a living, real ones made of concrete and steel, not promises and ego. I've survived losing a wife, a business downturn, and every kind of storm, except the kind your own blood can bring." Ethan's voice carried across the speakers. "Folks, I told Dad this was a modern event, no dusty antiques allowed." He flipped open the box. Inside lay my father's pocket watch, polished gold, ticking softly against velvet like a stubborn heartbeat, refusing to die. "Guess some people still live in the Stone Age," Ethan said. The crowd chuckled again. The cameras from the local network panned closer. 600 people witnessing the moment a son turned cruelty into entertainment. I didn't rise, didn't speak. I simply looked at the boy I'd once taught how to tell time on that very watch, and I wondered how many seconds of grace I had left before I'd stop forgiving him. The MC cleared his throat, desperate to shift tone. "Well, that's certainly a memorable piece of family history, but the damage was done." The laughter rolled like a slow wave through the ballroom, breaking against my silence. The sound of ice in crystal glasses, the whisper of designer gowns brushing marble, it all blurred into a steady hum beneath the ticking I could still hear from 50 feet away. I stood, straightened my tuxedo jacket, and met my son's eyes. For a moment, something flickered there, unease, maybe fear, but arrogance drowned it quickly. "Sit down, Dad," he said into the microphone, a smile still plastered across his face. "You're making the donors nervous." I nodded once and walked out through the golden doors, leaving his laughter behind me. Outside, the desert air was cool, quiet, honest. The kind of silence that repairs a man's dignity one breath at a time. Inside my jacket pocket, beneath the small weight of the forgotten gift receipt, lay another envelope, white-sealed, heavier than paper should ever feel. I touched it gently, like a switch waiting to be flipped. Tonight, my son had chosen humiliation. Soon he would meet precision. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know which corner of the world you're joining this story from tonight. I turned my collar up against the night breeze and looked back once at the glittering ballroom through glass walls. Pride glowed brighter than the chandeliers in there, but pride burns fast. Out here under the Arizona stars, time felt steady again. And so did my resolve. The desert night always had a way of calming me. The air outside Scottsdale smelled faintly of sage and dust, that quiet blend only the Arizona wind knows how to make. I drove home in silence, headlights carving through the darkness, while Ethan's laughter still echoed in my head. When I reached my house, simple single-story sandstone walls that I designed myself 40 years ago, I didn't turn on the lights. The quiet suited me. I poured a glass of bourbon, set it beside my worn leather chair, and reached for the small box still in my pocket. The gold pocket watch gleamed softly under the moonlight from the open blinds. It had survived 3 generations of Piercemen. Tonight, it had survived humiliation. I sat there for a long time, watching the second hand crawl its eternal circle. Every tick felt like a reminder that forgiveness also had limits. My wife Helen used to say, "Ray, someday you'll realize that giving too much is another form of pride." She was right, of course. I used to believe generosity could fix anything: bad habits, bad choices, bad sons. But money doesn't build character. It just gives weakness a bigger house to live in. Ethan had always been restless. At 12, he wanted to run a lemonade stand with gold-rimmed cups. At 22, he wanted a startup that looked rich before it earned a dime. And every time he failed, I caught him. I paid for the tuition he wasted $60,000 a year at Stanford. I bailed him out when his media company tanked. I even co-signed his mortgage for that glass and steel penthouse he flaunted online. Each check I wrote was supposed to buy him time to grow up, but instead, it just delayed the lesson. I opened the drawer beside me and took out a leather folder worn at the edges from years of quiet waiting. Inside were documents, thick embossed legal ownership certificates, stock transfers, deeds. On the top page, the words, "The Marlowe Grand Hotel," stood in elegant font. Below it, my name. Owner 51% controlling shares. That hotel, the same ballroom where Ethan had mocked me hours ago, was mine. I'd built it decades ago when I was still managing construction firms across the Southwest. Back then, it was my masterpiece. Ethan never knew that. He thought I'd sold everything when I retired. I smiled as the absurdity of it all settled in. He'd spent $300,000 renting his father's building to insult him inside it. A low, tired laugh escaped me. "You always loved drama, son," I murmured. "But this one's going to have an ending you didn't script." The watch ticked on, and I leaned back, letting the rhythm guide my thoughts. Tomorrow, I'd visit my attorney. I'd change the foundation papers. And by the end of the week, the Marlowe Grand would have a new owner. Not Ethan. Not me. But something far worthier of our family name. I poured another inch of bourbon, raised the glass toward Helen's photo on the mantel. Her smile hadn't faded in all these years. "You were right, my love," I whispered. "Sometimes the bridge needs to burn so both sides can finally see the light." As the clock neared midnight, I placed the pocket watch beside the glass, both ticking and glinting under the lamp's dim glow. My resolve felt like the desert stone, old, heavy, unmovable. Before going to bed, I opened my worn Bible to the page Helen had underlined decades ago. "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." I closed it gently, the words echoing in my chest. Because tonight, grace meant preparation. And God, I suspected, was giving me just enough time to act. Morning sunlight spilled across my study, turning the blueprints on my desk into gold. I'd kept those drawings for decades, the first bridge I ever designed, the one that connected 2 dusty Arizona towns and gave them a future. I used to believe a man could build anything strong enough to last marriages, businesses, even sons. But I'd learned the hard way that concrete and blood don't share the same strength. As the coffee brewed, I let the memories come. Ethan at 8 years old, sitting on my lap, tracing lines on graph paper. "Dad, one day I'll build something that makes people look up," he'd said. I smiled, then proud of his ambition. I didn't know that what he really wanted was people's attention, not their respect. At 12, he quit Little League because the coach didn't make him captain. At 16, he smashed his mother's car because I refused to buy him a new one just to fit in. Helen cried that night, but I stood firm. I told her if he doesn't learn consequences now, life will teach him later. I never imagined that lesson would arrive on stage under chandeliers. After Helen's passing, Ethan changed, or maybe he just learned to hide his greed better. When he came home from college talking about startups and brand image, I wanted to believe it was maturity. Instead, it was a marketing degree with no soul. I invested anyway $250,000 from my retirement savings. He promised it was the next big media firm. 16 months later, it collapsed under unpaid loans and empty promises. I remember sitting across from him at the bank signing the bailout papers while he scrolled through his phone. "You've always been my safety net," he said like it was a compliment. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not anger, not disappointment, just a quiet understanding I had raised a man who believed help was his birthright. I spent years trying to repair that mistake. Helped him buy his first home, covered tax debts, watched him marry Vanessa, a woman who treated humility like it was contagious. When they divorced 6 months later, he cried on my doorstep saying, "Dad, I just need one more chance." And like a fool, I gave it to him. Now he had another Vanessa, a younger, louder version who broadcast her life like a product launch. Together, they built an empire of image-renting sports cars for photo shoots, staging charity events that cost more than they raised. Every post tagged, "Pierce Legacy." The irony wasn't lost on me. As I watched the sunlight crawl across my desk, I realized how many bridges I'd built in my life, and how many times Ethan had set them on fire to warm himself. I opened the leather folder again. The documents lay there waiting. My lawyer's number was already dialed into my phone. Helen's voice came back to me soft and steady from a world away. "Ray, you can't save him from himself, but you can stop him from hurting others." She was right. Maybe I couldn't fix Ethan, but I could make sure he never used my work to destroy what little integrity our name still had. I took a pen from the desk, same one I'd signed every major contract of my career, and wrote 3 simple words on a sticky note. "No more rescues." Then I placed it on the folder. The house was silent except for the tick of that old pocket watch on the mantel. I looked up at Helen's framed portrait, her eyes steady, kind, forgiving. "Today's the day, sweetheart," I whispered. "Time to build one last structure justice." By noon, the Arizona sun had turned the streets into mirrors. I drove downtown with the windows cracked, the air thick with heat and something sharper, resolve. My destination wasn't far, the old law office I'd used since my construction days, the one that handled every permit, every contract, every deal that bore the Pierce name. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and oak polish. My attorney Daniel Kerr rose when I entered. He'd aged alongside my fortune-gray hair, steady hands, and eyes that had seen every kind of family dispute money could breed. Raymond he greeted, motioning to the leather chair across from his desk. "I saw the gala on the news. You held your composure better than any man I know." I sat, setting the leather folder between us. "That composure has an expiration date, Dan." He didn't smile. He'd heard that tone before, the one that meant something irreversible was coming. "You're ready to proceed with the transfer." I nodded. Everything goes to the foundation. The Marlowe Grand, the investment accounts, the trust holdings, all under the Helen Pierce Foundation for Education and Shelter. He flipped through the folder, scanning the figures. That's nearly $4.5 million in total assets. Are you sure you want to exclude Ethan entirely? My eyes drifted to the window. Outside, a young father crossed the street, holding his son's hand, pointing up at the skyline like it was a promise. I'd been that man once. I'm not excluding him, I said slowly. He excluded himself when he chose pride over respect. Daniel nodded, understanding. I'll file the changes today. Once processed, he'll have no legal claim. Good, I said, my voice steady. I'm tired of being a ladder for someone who keeps jumping off. He pushed the papers toward me, pen balanced perfectly beside them. You know, Ray, I've handled hundreds of wills. Most parents hesitate before doing something like this. I picked up the pen, feeling its familiar weight. Most parents don't get humiliated on live television by the child they raised. This isn't revenge, Dan. It's correction. The nib touched paper. My signature flowed smoothly, each letter anchoring years of mistakes. When I finished, Daniel gathered the documents and sealed them in a thick white envelope. There it is, he said. The end of one chapter. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. No, Dan, this is the blueprint for the next one. He smiled faintly. You sound like the old engineer again. I never stopped being one, I said. I just shifted from bridges to boundaries. On the way out, I paused at the receptionist's desk. A small decorative sign read, "Justice delayed is justice denied." I couldn't help but grin. For once, the law and I agreed. Outside, the sun was brutal, but I didn't mind. I loosened my tie and stood beside my car, feeling the heat through my shoes. Across the street, a church bell rang, 3 short chimes that carried through the afternoon. I looked up at its steeple and whispered, God doesn't always build bridges for us. Sometimes he hands us the hammer. Then I placed the sealed envelope into my briefcase, the same one Ethan used to borrow for job interviews, and drove home. Halfway there, the radio cut through the hum of the engine with a breaking news headline about the Pierce family gala trending online. I switched it off. There was nothing left to hear. What mattered was already decided, written, sealed, and blessed by something greater than pride. If you're still with me, type 1 in the comments. Let's see who's been following every turn of this story so far. Back home, I poured myself a cup of black coffee, not bourbon this time. Justice, I thought, was best served sober. The desert sky over Scottsdale turned the color of molten gold as the sun fell behind the mountains. From my balcony, I could already hear the faint thrum of traffic heading toward the Marlowe Grand. The hotel's name glowed like a promise across the skyline, my hotel, though no one seemed to remember that anymore. I adjusted my cufflinks, the same pair I'd worn when Helen and I first opened the Marlowe's doors 35 years ago. That night, we'd toasted hard work, faith, and the belief that good men could still build something honest. Now my son was using the same ballroom to sell an illusion. I slipped the white envelope into my jacket's inner pocket, feeling the cool weight of the sealed papers against my chest. Then I picked up the old pocket watch, the one that had once survived wars, mortgages, and heartbreak, and tucked it beside the envelope. 2 symbols, one of time, one of truth. By the time I reached the hotel, the valet lane looked like a car dealership for the rich and restless Bentleys, Maseratis, electric Porsches, humming under the glow of string lights. Photographers lined the red carpet, calling out names I didn't recognize, but Ethan basked in every flash, every handshake. He wore a midnight tuxedo tailored within an inch of arrogance. Vanessa stood at his side, wrapped in gold sequins that caught the camera like sunlight on water. Her laughter was louder than the orchestra playing behind the doors. Dad, Ethan called as I stepped onto the carpet. "You made it." His tone was smooth, public, performative. He gave me a quick hug that felt like a photo op. "Try to smile for the cameras, yeah, tonight's about family legacy. Legacy." The word hit me like an echo from a hollow place. Inside the ballroom gleamed brighter than I remembered glass chandeliers, crystal vases, and centerpieces dripping with orchids. Each table had a brass nameplate engraved with donor levels, Platinum Diamond Legacy Partner. I found my name at a table near the stage, but slightly off-center. Strategically visible, I thought. Ethan wanted me close enough for the cameras, but not close enough for the conversation. Servers glided between tables carrying trays of champagne flutes and truffle canapes. I didn't touch a thing. The room buzzed with the false energy of people pretending to make a difference while competing to be seen doing it. Vanessa made her entrance next to the crowd, parting like scripture. "Tonight," she said into the microphone, her voice sweet and rehearsed, "we celebrate generosity, vision, and the Pierce family legacy." Applause rippled through the hall. Ethan took the stage next. "My father built the foundation I stand on," he said, smiling down at me, "and tonight I plan to elevate it." He paused just long enough for the laughter to land. I sipped water, eyes never leaving him. It was the same grin he'd worn as a boy when he lied about breaking windows, charming, disarming, hollow. For an hour, speeches and donations danced around the room. Names were announced, checks were waved, and photographers captured every smile. Ethan's empire of image was thriving, and I was about to bring it to its final structural test. Near the end of dinner, the MC announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude, a special moment from the Pierce family." Ethan looked down at me. "Dad, would you join me?" All eyes turned. The chandeliers flickered slightly as I rose, buttoning my tuxedo jacket. The envelope pressed against my ribs, steady, certain. "Of course, son," I said. My voice carried through the hall even without a microphone. I walked toward the stage, each step slow, deliberate, the same way I used to walk the scaffolding of my bridges, one careful stride at a time. The music softened. Cameras lifted. Tonight I thought the foundation will be tested. The smile never left my face. But deep down, the engineer in me was ready. Because nothing collapses faster than pride, built on weak beams. The chandeliers dimmed to a golden hush as I climbed the steps to the stage. Ethan's smile widened, half pride, half performance. Vanessa stood behind him, camera ready, the sequins of her gown catching the light like tiny knives. 600 guests waited, phones lifted, ready to record another moment of family legacy. Ethan handed me the microphone with a casual flourish. "Everyone," he announced, "let's give my father a round of applause. He's the reason I'm here tonight." Literally. Laughter rippled through the crowd. I took the microphone, weighing it like an old tool in my hand. "Thank you, son," I said, my voice calm, measured. "It's true I built the foundation you're standing on. I just didn't expect you'd be renting it from me at such a premium." The audience chuckled politely. not realizing how literal that sentence was. Ethan gave a tight grin, confused but unwilling to lose control of the spotlight. "Dad always jokes like that," he said quickly to smooth the tension. "He's old school." I set the microphone aside and reached into my jacket pocket. The ballroom fell into a hush as I pulled out a small velvet box, the same one Ethan had mocked weeks earlier. I opened it slowly. The pocket watch gleamed under the chandelier, light gold catching gold, time itself turning against him. "I gave this to my son," once I said, my voice carrying even without the mic. "He called it outdated, said it belonged in a museum. But this watch has been passed through 3 generations of Pierce men. Every man who wore it earned it." A murmur swept the crowd. Ethan leaned forward, forcing a laugh. "Dad, we talked about this. This is a gala, not story hour." I ignored him. My grandfather wore it through the Depression. My father wore it while building hospitals after the war. And I wore it while constructing this very hotel. Gasps fluttered through the tables. I saw Vanessa's eyes sharpen. Ethan froze, his expression flickering with something close to panic. I continued, slow and deliberate. "Yes, this hotel. The Marlowe Grand. The same one my son rented tonight. The same one he bragged about owning shares in." I reached into my jacket again and withdrew the white envelope. "He told the media he built this legacy. That's half true, he's been building it on sand." The guests shifted uneasily. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Cameras flashed faster now, like lightning in a storm. Ethan stepped forward, grabbing the microphone. "Dad, that's enough." "You're embarrassing yourself." I took it back from his trembling hand. "No, son. I'm finishing what you started." The envelope's seal broke with a clean tear. Inside were the notarized documents, transfer papers, signatures, legal proof. I held them up for all to see. These papers used to name Ethan Pierce as my successor. They no longer do. The crowd gasped. Vanessa's jaw dropped. This hotel, along with all Pierce assets, now belongs to the Helen Pierce Foundation. My late wife believed wealth meant nothing if it didn't serve others. Tonight, I'm honoring that. Silence. Then a single stunned clap. Then another. Soon half the room was applauding, some awkwardly, others with conviction. Ethan's face turned crimson. "You can't do this," he shouted, voice cracking through the speakers. You've lost your mind." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "No, Ethan. I just found it." Vanessa lunged toward the papers, but I raised them higher. "Careful," I said softly. "They're legal now." Gasps turned to whispers. Someone in the back muttered, "He just cut him off right here." I leaned closer to the mic one last time. My wife once told me God humbles the proud in his own timing. I guess tonight he decided to let me help. I set the microphone down, placed the watch gently beside it, and turned toward the exit. Behind me, chaos began, Vanessa shouting, Ethan calling my name, reporters rushing forward, but all I heard was the quiet tick of that old watch on the table. Justice, I thought, always keeps perfect time. The moment I stepped off that stage, the ballroom erupted. The calm that had once shimmered beneath the chandeliers fractured into chaos, voices overlapping, cameras flashing 100 conversations colliding into noise. Somewhere behind me, Ethan's voice cracked through the microphone, "Dad, you can't just... This isn't legal." I didn't turn around. I'd heard that tone before, the sound of a man who'd mistaken privilege for protection. I walked slowly toward the doors while waiters froze mid-stride, unsure whether to serve dessert or witness history. Mr. Pierce, a journalist, called from my left, her voice trembling with excitement. "Did you really just give away your entire estate?" I stopped, glanced back toward the stage. Ethan was still standing there, face pale under the golden lights, the envelope crushed in his hands. Vanessa clutched his arm like a drowning woman grabbing driftwood. "Yes," I said quietly. "I built those walls for shelter, not for pride. It's time they house people who need them." A few guests clapped, not polite applause this time, but something raw, human, approving. It spread like a ripple across the room. Others stared uncomfortable, realizing they'd been cheering for a man who had just lost millions of dollars in front of them. Ethan finally found his footing. "You've lost your mind," he shouted, microphone still in hand. "You're ruining my career, our name." I faced him fully. Then the distance between us filled with 600 witnesses and a lifetime of unspoken truths. "No, son," I said, voice calm enough to cut through the noise. "You did that when you traded integrity for attention." He stumbled down from the platform, nearly tripping on Vanessa's train. The photographers surged forward, flashes popping like fireworks. "You can't just humiliate me like this." I smiled faintly. "Humiliation is public, Ethan. Consequence is private. You're feeling both tonight." Vanessa lunged for the papers, shrieking, "You just threw away our future." Her voice echoed off the marble walls, thin and desperate. $4.5 million gone because you needed a moment." "Not gone," I corrected softly. "Redirected." The hotel manager, an old friend of mine, appeared beside me. "Mr. Pierce, do you want us to escort anyone out?" I looked at Ethan, sweat glistening on his forehead tie, undone his image unraveling in real time. "No," I said. "Let him stay. Let him see what it looks like when truth walks out on a liar." The cameras caught every second. Vanessa buried her face in her hands. Ethan turned to the crowd, searching for sympathy, but found only silence. Every smile that had once orbited him now avoided his eyes. As I reached the doorway, I paused. The orchestra, unsure what else to do, began playing again, soft strings filling the air, pretending everything was normal. The irony wasn't lost on me. I turned once more to face the crowd. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said. "The Pierce name will still be on the building, but after tonight, it stands for something again." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was sincere. Ethan collapsed into a chair, the microphone still live. His voice came through the speakers, broken and small. "Dad, please, wait." For a second I almost did. But then I remembered Helen's voice. "Mercy without change is just another mistake." I adjusted my cufflinks, straightened my jacket, and walked out beneath the same crystal chandeliers I'd hung with my own hands decades ago. Outside, the night was cool and silent, a contrast so sharp it felt holy. I could still hear faint echoes of chaos behind me, voices rising, glass breaking, the sound of pride collapsing. And for the first time in years, I felt weightless. The foundation had been tested, and everything that wasn't built on truth had fallen exactly as it should. By the next morning, my name was everywhere. The $4.5 million lesson retired engineer publicly cuts his son out of his fortune. That was the headline on the Scottsdale Tribune, and beneath it was a still shot of me leaving the ballroom, tuxedo, crisp eyes, forward, the faintest hint of a smile on my face. Ethan's photo sat beside mine, but it told a different story. His expression was a mixture of shock and humiliation, the image of a man realizing the world had finally stopped believing him. I sat on my porch with my morning coffee, the newspaper folded neatly on the table beside me. The desert wind was soft that day, almost gentle, like even the air respected what had happened. By noon, the story had spread to national outlets. Some people called me cruel. Others called me a hero. I didn't care for either title. I hadn't done it for attention. I'd done it for balance. When you've spent a lifetime building, you learn that weak foundations must be rebuilt, or they collapse under their own weight. My lawyer Daniel called to say the foundation's paperwork had gone through overnight. The Marlowe Grand was officially property of the Helen Pierce Foundation. He sounded almost proud when he said it. Ray donations are already flooding in. You might have started something bigger than you intended. I only intended to end something, I told him. That evening, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there. No tuxedo, no photographers, just a wrinkled shirt, a week's worth of regret on his face. "Dad," he said quietly, "I came to return this." He held out the pocket watch, polished again, the chain coiled neatly in his trembling hand. I cleaned it. I thought maybe you'd want it back." I looked at the watch, then at him. "It was never about the watch, Ethan." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I didn't understand what I was doing that night. Everything was moving so fast. The cameras, the pressure. Vanessa, stop." I raised a hand. "Don't blame her. Pride doesn't need help to destroy a man. It just needs time." Tears filled his eyes, and for a brief second I saw the boy I used to teach how to draw bridges in pencil. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. I took the watch from his hand and placed it back into his palm. "Keep it," I said. "Maybe it'll remind you that time doesn't give refunds. Only lessons." He looked at the watch, then at me as if expecting anger. But all he found was exhaustion. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Start over," I said simply, "but this time build something that lasts." He nodded, blinking away shame, and walked back toward the street. The sun caught the edge of the watch chain, swinging from his hand, gold flashing one last time, before it disappeared behind the corner. That night I returned to the Marlowe Grand. The new foundation staff had already cleared the ballroom, replacing the champagne towers with long tables stacked with supplies, food boxes, blankets, backpacks. The chandeliers still sparkled, but now they lit something real. As I walked through the quiet space, a young volunteer stopped me. "Mr. Pierce," she said, smiling, "thank you for this place." People already started lining up outside. "It's beautiful what you've done." I looked around at the walls I'd built with Helen decades ago, at the marble floor that had once hosted pride and now held purpose. "It's not me you should thank," I said. "Just time doing its job." She tilted her head. "And what job is that?" "Turning endings," I said, "into blueprints." Outside, the desert wind carried the faint scent of rain, rare, clean, merciful. I took it as a sign. Helen once told me that faith isn't found in what we keep, but in what we're brave enough to let go of. Standing there watching volunteers fill the space that used to feed vanity, I finally understood what she meant. For the first time in years, the hotel felt alive. And for the first time in decades, so did I. A full year passed before I realized how much lighter life had become without the weight of pretense. The desert had a way of softening everything, the edges of mountains, the echoes of memory, even the sting of old betrayals. From my back porch, I could see the spire of the Marlowe Grand in the distance, its name now etched in bronze beneath new letters, the Helen Pierce Foundation. Every Friday, the volunteers sent me photos, lines of families receiving meals, veterans finding work, children laughing in rooms that once echoed with empty applause. Those chandeliers that once spotlighted arrogance now shone over kindness. It was Helen's dream come alive, though she'd never lived to see it. I still woke early. Old habits die slower than pride. Coffee at 6, newspaper by 6:30, then a quiet walk around the property. Some mornings I'd find small signs of change, a flower growing through gravel, a neighbor waving instead of rushing past. Tiny proof that maybe after all the noise, goodness still had gravity. One morning, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. The handwriting stopped me before I even opened it, careful, deliberate, too familiar to mistake. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper and a photograph. Ethan stood in front of a modest building, a community shelter somewhere in Phoenix. The sign behind him read, "The Second Chance Project." The letter was short. "Dad, I've been volunteering here 6 months. The work's not glamorous, but it's real. Every day I hear people's stories and realize how much time I wasted chasing approval instead of purpose. You were right, I didn't lose everything that night. I just finally saw what everything wasn't. Thank you for letting me fall far enough to understand the ground. Love, Ethan." I sat for a long time with that letter in my hands. Pride didn't twist inside me this time, just gratitude and a quiet ache that felt almost holy. That afternoon, I drove into town, bought a small brass plaque, and had it engraved with 5 words, "Time forgives those who learn." The engraver didn't ask questions, and I didn't explain. I just drove to the Marlowe Grand and handed it to the foundation director. "Put it somewhere people can see it," I said. Some lessons belong to everyone. As I walked the halls, the volunteers greeted me with smiles that reminded me of my younger self, before the wealth, before the noise. Every blueprint I'd ever drawn was meant to keep something standing. Now I finally understood the most important one was invisible, the structure that holds a man's soul steady when everything else shakes. Before leaving, I stood beneath the same chandelier where Ethan's arrogance had cracked open our family name. The light caught the marble in a way I'd never noticed before, gentle, forgiving. That's when I realized something simple: justice isn't the opposite of love. It's what love looks like when it finally stops apologizing. I smiled, turned toward the exit, and whispered to Helen's memory, "You were right again, sweetheart. We built the right bridge after all." The pocket watch ticked softly in my vest pocket, no longer heavy, no longer haunted. Just steady, just alive. The lesson was complete. Even now when the sun goes down over the desert, I can still hear the faint ticking of that old pocket watch. It sits on my desk by the window next to Helen's photo, its gold surface dulled by time but steady as ever. Every evening it catches the last orange light before the sky fades to blue. And every time I hear that sound, I remember that night in the ballroom, the flash of chandeliers, the laughter, the silence that followed. It doesn't sting anymore. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of memory until they fit in your palm like river stones. The Marlowe Grand hums quietly in the distance. The foundation keeps growing. The rooms that once smelled of champagne now carry the aroma of fresh bread, warm meals, clean laundry. The same marble floors that reflected vanity now echo with laughter. Last month, they opened a new wing, a learning center for single mothers, and named it the Helen Hall. They invited me to cut the ribbon, but I declined. That moment belonged to new hands, younger hearts. I prefer to visit when no one expects me. I'll walk through the corridors unnoticed, listening. Not for applause, but for the small sounds that prove the world is still healing. Pencils scratching on notebooks, the splash of a mop in a bucket, a child humming to herself while she draws on the wall's corner chalkboard. It's funny, I spent my life designing structures to withstand earthquakes, yet the most solid thing I ever built didn't need steel. It needed grace. Sometimes people ask if I ever reconciled with Ethan. I tell them the truth, yes, in the only way that matters. Forgiveness isn't always a handshake or a family dinner. Sometimes it's a letter folded and worn, sitting quietly in a drawer. Sometimes it's the knowledge that the person who once broke your heart finally learned how to live with their own. Ethan sends postcards now, one from each shelter he helps repair. The work's hard, he wrote last time, but I think I'm finally earning the name. The handwriting's steadier these days, less desperate. That's how I know he's finding peace. On Sundays, I drive out to the ridge just beyond the city. It's the same spot where Helen and I once brought a blanket and coffee to watch the sunrise when the hotel was only an idea. Back then, she said something I never forgot. Faith isn't waiting for miracles, Ray. It's doing the work that makes them possible. She was right. I used to pray for Ethan to change. Now I just thank God for giving me the strength to change first, to stop enabling, to stop rescuing, to let truth do what truth does best, rebuild. One evening, I found myself back in the ballroom long after hours. The staff had gone home, the lights were low, and the grand chandelier shimmered in quiet dignity. I stood in the center of the floor, where everything had fallen apart, and everything had begun again. The marble beneath my shoes still held a faint scratch, the mark from the night Ethan dropped the microphone. It made me smile. I whispered, "Some scars deserve to stay." I sat down in the front row, the same spot I'd avoided all those years, and let the silence speak. My faith has never been loud. It doesn't need trumpets or sermons. It lives in that silence, in the way justice and mercy can share the same heartbeat. When I got home, the sky was a deep velvet blue. I poured a cup of tea, opened my Bible, and read the verse Helen had underlined decades ago. He has made everything beautiful in its time. For a long while, I just sat there, the ticking of the watch and the desert wind outside blending into something almost holy. I don't think justice is punishment anymore. Justice is clarity. It's God handing you the blueprints and saying, "Now build better." That's what I did. And I'd do it again, not out of anger, but out of love strong enough to stop pretending. So if you're listening now, wherever you are, remember this. You don't owe your peace to anyone who demands it through guilt. You earn it by standing still long enough to hear what your silence is trying to tell you. I took one last look at the stars above the desert, each one sharp as a promise. The wind moved through the cacti like a hymn. "Thank you, Helen," I said softly. We finished the bridge. The pocket watch ticked once steady, certain, eternal. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to Brian's Stories. Share it with someone who believes dignity never retires, and tell me in the comments what justice means to you. Because sometimes the quietest endings are the ones that save us all.